give a warm welcome to the hosts of the Bride of Alternate Ending.
Hello, ghouls and goblins, and welcome back to Bride of Alternate Ending. I am your ghost, Brennan Klein, and with me, as always, is my co-ghost, Tim Brayton. How are you doing, Tim? Hello.
I am hot as hell, Brennan. How are you doing?
I'm also hot as hell. Not temperature-wise, as I think you were referring to. It's actually quite balmy here in Southern California.
Yeah, I remember learning a few years ago that Southern California is, in fact, just pleasantly cool and chilly in June. And I found that weird, and I wasn't prepared for it.
Well, yeah, our summers need kind of a runway because, yeah, June and early July, I'm an idiot and I always forget what happened the previous year. So I'm like, this is going to be a great summer. It's been like 71 up to like low 80s. I can deal with that. And then it hits the 90s and hundreds and stays that way till Halloween, which is punishing. And also then everything catches on fire, and then all the smoke traps the heat in the atmosphere. It's lovely out here.
Yeah, no, it is not a place where people are supposed to live, so it's strange to me that so many millions of you do. But
yeah,
that's another conversation.
Mm-hmm. And because we are in a desert area, there's always a chance that hyper intelligent ants will arrive to destroy us.
Because that's what desert areas do. They breed hyper-intelligent ants. Am I right?
They do. They at least all the evidence that I have would suggest this. But yeah. So what we're referring to is the plot-ish of the movie that we're discussing today. This is the first episode of June, and we are covering. Our topic this month is June bugs. Thanks to Tim for that glorious pun. Yeah, we're discussing...
I was going to say, I think that the quality of the pun announces its author fairly quickly in the case of June bugs.
No, I like it. Yeah, so we're talking about... You're welcome. We're talking about bug horror. We're talking about the 1974 film Phase 4. That's in Roman numerals, everybody. This movie was directed by Saul Bass. Is the only feature-length narrative film he directed, which... Instantly, I knew that it was going to be an interesting movie.
Right, which just for the sake of clarity, for those of you who don't immediately recognize the name Saul Bass, he is a graphic designer who, in a cinematic context, is absolutely unquestionably best known for his title sequences. Mostly, although certainly not limited to, the wonderful sequences he did for Alfred Hitchcock films over the years. So when you hear... title sequence designer making his directorial debut, if your ears don't perk up on some level, I don't know how you even exist in the world.
Yeah, and I'm fascinated in general by people who do other jobs in film that only ever directed one movie. So like the other major example I can think of is Walter Murch, who's like editor extraordinaire, and then he just popped out Return to Oz. That was his directorial statement. Was Return to Oz, and there's something so fun and peculiar about the projects that these people choose.
Yeah, I can think of a couple other examples, and they are always very sort of interesting. Charles Laughton making only Night of the Hunter is sort of the go-to for me of that kind of thing, and I'm trying to remember. I just want to verify. Nope, I was going to say, did Doug Trumbull only make Brainstorm, but Brainstorm was actually his second of two movies.
It's at least tangential to this conversation, I think.
Yes.
But yeah, there's always something particularly interesting about that, especially in the 70s and 80s, which were kind of a hotbed of this kind of feverish production that could just exist and go out into theaters. Not necessarily make money, as Phase 4 proved.
Yeah, there is a reason why Saul Bass only made one directorial feature.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is that it tanked.
Yeah, but Phase 4. So going into this movie, I knew almost nothing about it. Like it came up in our kind of research for what are bug horror movies that we can discuss. And I recognized the poster because it's got a really cool poster. Of like a hand reaching up with an ant crawling around it. But I didn't even realize it was a bug movie specifically.
I want to pin something down. It is not merely an ant on a hand. It is an ant emerging from the stigmata-like bloody hole in the middle of a hand's palm.
Yes, indeed. But yeah, so I was intrigued by the poster, but never really thought about the movie beyond that. And then actually sitting down to watch it was an interesting experience. But you've seen this movie before, right?
Yes. So the film was it had a very strange, abstract, avant-garde ending, and that ending was removed by the studio when the film premiered, and was not like, it always existed, but it never really got seen again until I think 2019. It was sort of tacked back onto the film, and the version I saw in 2020 was, if I recall correctly, sort of one of the debut streaming premieres of that extended version of the film. So I first saw it in 2020, to answer your question. Unlike you, its reputation did precede it when I saw it. This is sort of, I think, noted as... I don't certainly want to say an early version of art horror, because I think art horror brings with it baggage that this film is not involved in. Like, this is not elevated horror 70s style. This is something very different than that. But I think the Saul Bassiness is something people have been looking for a very long time. So I had at least been primed to expect a movie that was going to do some very strange and quasi-abstract things in the imagery. And I find it does do that. And we'll talk about that, I'm sure. But, when I saw this for the first time 3 years ago, I sort of did come into it with that baggage, that I was expecting something that would wow me visually, if not in any of the other ways things can wow me.
Got it. Yeah, so, and I think, we came to it from two entirely separate places. It's actually a reverse of what happened with Teen Witch, I think. But yeah, so I think I'm going to attempt to talk about what Phase 4 is about to some degree.
I think it's easier to talk about the plot than it feels like while you're watching the movie, because there's a very just simple and straightforward amount of plot.
Yeah.
Really. But it doesn't, while you're watching it doesn't seem that way. So, like, I get why you feel a little trepidation about trying to take us down that path. But why don't we start?
Yeah, okay. So, so about 2 minutes into the movie, I was like, oh, okay, this is what we're doing. And I definitely was like, okay, so Tim likes this movie more than I do, before even knowing if you'd seen it or checking your Letterboxd score or anything. But I was a little nervous that it was going to turn into a nature documentary Skinamarink, because like the first 10 minutes or so is basically just close-up footage of ants with some vague 70s narration over it. And I was like, I could try to get on this wavelength, but I think I would hate this movie. And I did not hate Phase 4, but it's definitely, like, it immediately announces itself as this is going to be a vibes movie for sure. So basically we get the sense that, well, so Phase 4 is not something that actually happens until the end or after the end of the film. We kind of go through the first three phases of essentially this evolutionary development of ants. Is it because of some sort of message from space? Who knows? But it's basically... Yeah?
The film... So there's always a sort of what if that people talk about as a, let's look at how animal life is distributed across this planet. And one way I heard it phrased was, at a first approximation, every species on Earth is a bug or is an insect. There are many, 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 many insects. And so you always sort of hear this kind of what if presented in terms of there are so many insects, specifically there are so many ants. What would happen if they were the dominant species on Earth? And in fact, are they not the dominant species on Earth? They just don't care about anything other than other ants, so we don't really notice that. Phase 4 is basically the film saying, so what if they decided that because they, in a sense, already are the dominant species on Earth, they should do something about that?
Yeah, but it's in a more cerebral, ethereal way. Like, this isn't Frogs, from 72. No. So basically, after this kind of wind-up where you're getting the sense that, like, okay, there's some sort of doomsday that we're building towards, where ants will develop the strength and intelligence to overthrow the humans in some capacity, or reshape the world as we know it. Basically, these two scientists arrive on the scene in this northern Arizona desert where this kind of tribe of hyper-intelligent ants is kind of causing a little bit of ecological mayhem. Like, there are formerly opposing ant tribes that are now working together. The amount of ant predators in the area has suddenly vanished. These two doctors are, this randomly British guy, Dr. Hubbs, played by Nigel Davenport, and he's hanging around with James R. Lesko, a game theory not numerologist, but he studies game theory. He's played by Michael Murphy.
He's a mathematician.
Yeah, mathematician. He's the Jeff Goldblum of the gang from Jurassic Park. Mm-hmm. And so basically, he's applying game theory and math to try and translate what the messages the ants are sending to the world and to each other. And they somehow erect this giant laboratory Epcot Center dome in the middle of the desert, and I'm not totally clear on how they had the materials and wherewithal to make that happen, but it looks cool. Mm-hmm. And they study the ants, and they're kind of trying to provoke the ants and see what they're doing and experimenting on them. There is a pretty cool collection of anthill obelisks that's just kind of sticking out of the ground. And there's a nearby, so basically the nearby neighborhood has been evacuated. It was like this destitute town that everyone was perfectly willing to leave anyway, except for one farming family who basically, I guess spoiler alert, but this is not a spoiler movie. They get destroyed by ants with the exception of Kendra Eldridge, played by Lynn Frederick, who shows up to kind of promise that there might be a love interest in the movie, but that doesn't really pan out, and she just kind of becomes a metaphor. Pretty
much. Which to be fair, everything in the movie is kind of a metaphor. But in a film that is certainly not about its characters, I feel like she is the one who I have the hardest time parsing in any way.
Yeah, and
I don't know why she's in this movie. I mean, I do, but as a character who has psychology, it is difficult for me to tell you what makes Kendra tick.
Oh, very much. And she's an extra slippery character because of her horrible American accent. She's playing this Arizona. Well, everything's a little off about her because she's playing this almost prepubescent Arizona teenager. But the actress was in her 20s, and apparently they had her kind of wear a binder kind of thing to slim down her figure. Mm-hmm. And according to reports, Saul Bass was very demanding of her, making her practice her lines over and over again until her American accent was perfect. And I would just argue that Saul Bass's interpretation of a perfect American accent is not that.
I was gonna say, it feels kind of like a reverse Bresson situation, where instead of the director over-rehearsing the actor until the actor has lost their ability to judge their own dialogue delivery, this feels like the actor wearing the director down until the director could no longer hear her voice. Because if Bass thought that she landed on her American accent, Bass is deaf.
Yes, very much. Is Saul Bass of American extraction? Maybe that just...
He must be. I don't actually know. Let me see if I can find that out. But I will raise the filmmakers of 47 years ago, however many years ago. Yes, Saul Bass was American.
Okay.
If you look at a picture of Saul Bass, which I don't think I've ever done before, your immediate instinctive response to this man is he never left the Bronx, and boy, that in fact is where he was born. So, but there are American teenagers who act, and there were in 1974, just as there are now. Why not just hire one of them?
Yeah, yeah, an absolute mystery. Yeah, so I mean, it adds to this weird ethereal quality of the movie, although obviously that was not on purpose. But it's kind of like Isabel Fuhrman in the Orphan sequel, where it's just everything's kind of off, and
Right.
it's just very peculiar to watch. But anyway, so the first time you watched this movie, you were essentially like a little overhyped and maybe less impressed with it than you were expected to be. Did you find that to be the same case on the second watch?
To be honest, I found my experience so perfectly mapped onto my first viewing that I did not even bother writing new information in my Letterboxd repost. I just posted that I rewatched it. This is a movie. So I will say this to start. You and I had precisely opposite journeys through this film, which is, I see that opening 10 minutes where it's basically just close-ups of ants with kind of strangely, like, thematically focused, but grammatically and dramatically just kind of very wobbly and amorphous, floaty 70s narration. I'm ready to strap in for that movie. As you said, that is a Tim movie. And when it is clear that it will at some point not just be that, I kind of had a very distinct both times, like, oh, okay, well, I guess that was a good opening, and I just kind of sit back into to mostly pay attention to the remainder of the film. This is a film that I will say twice now, I've had a very hard time keeping my full attention on it. For its less than 90-minute running time.
Yes. And I would say that for my viewing experience, I think it suddenly developing a script and characters makes it more palatable, but I don't think that they actually add value to the movie that it promises in the opening act. If that makes sense?
It does. It is exactly, I think, the right way to describe it. Like, it is a film for which you can clearly tell that the director never really had an interest in the story. Like, it was the film he could get financed, but I think he pretty clearly, his heart belongs to the amorphous montage of ants art film elements of it. And there's, I think, just a very clear, like, it deflates when it goes to its scenes about Michael Murphy doing ant math.
Yeah, no, I
don't know, maybe that's just me.
Well, it becomes, I mean, look, we've both seen our fair share of the 50s movies that this is kind of an art house extrapolation of. And the science scenes in those movies, which can be poppy and fun and kind of popcorny, those scenes you kind of have to turn your brain off too, because it's just like, okay, there's yammering at a computer. Let's just let's move on and wait for some more big ants to stomp through. But look, okay. Shortly before we hit record, we talked about how horniness can sometimes be a valuable facet to watching a movie, especially if it's not grabbing you in the proper way. I look, as a classic horror fan, especially as a fan of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, like a sweaty dude with his collar open and just like in really hot denim that's really tight is like, it kind of does it for me. So that was nice.
I respect that reaction, even if I find the 70s-ness of our leads to just be a little bit smothering to my own sense of hotness.
Yeah, no, that's fair. There is a version of me that I pull out of the back of my brain when I am watching a 70s movie and he's having a good time.
That is fair and good. And And there's certainly a lot of that. One of the things the ants do, for unknown reasons, is that they increase the temperature inside the lab where the humans are to unbearable degrees during the day, and then reduce it during the night. And the humans figure that this is in some way about like trying to control them, and they eventually sort of figure out why that is, sort of. But it does mean that we get lots of scenes of the characters just like caked in sweat in this like metallic oven, essentially.
Yeah, which is, again, I think it's got a strong atmosphere.
It does.
In just this sense of being trapped in this kind of tedious and miserable situation, which is not something that I value in a movie, but it does a very good job. But yeah, so I think ultimately the stuff that I did respond to, other than like having a little bit of something to follow and then be like, okay, I don't really like this, but just having something to click my brain into is always a little nice for my poor little brain. But yeah, the atmosphere is ultimately the reason this movie exists, and this is the reason it should exist. I think it's largely very interesting. It's got a very cool, like, early kind of eerie electronic score that's like, it's not doing the synth thing. It's just like these kind of electronic noises, kind of like it's definitely of a line with like that early Forbidden Planet score, like just the kind of weird electric noises that are just kind of off-putting and jarring and ethereal.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, there's definitely, you said earlier it was a sort of vibes movie, and I think that is just undeniably the case. It is a movie made by a graphic designer. I mean, yeah. I think that is a good, simple way of sort of explaining what's going on here. And that is a good and fine thing. But I think, to me at least, it would be even more good and more fine if it were a 12-minute short.
I would not,
directed by the same graphic designer.
I would not disagree with you.
Like duration is this film's enemy, even though it's a nice tight, the 84-minute cut, which is the one that does not have the restored ending, is the one I watched. 84 minutes is the best time, right? Like, that's how long you want your killer bug movie to be. It has a very hard time. I think this is literally now the second time I've said this, but like, those are not 84 minutes that are just rocketing towards the finish line. I mean, it is a wandering, dithering, let's have the same scene 3 different times sort of 84 minutes. And I don't think there's nothing there, and I certainly at some point want to get to talking about what the film's strengths are, but like, it's boring.
Yeah.
That's all there is to say.
For
it's
sure.
A boring movie.
Yeah, no question about that. I think it has these brief moments where the visuals and not the storyline per se, but the sense of like the cost of what's going on becomes clear. Like especially like I think the points where those intersect are really, really good. Like after the ants attack the homestead that's nearby, that scene in and of itself is fine. But basically the scientists think that the area has been completely evacuated. They don't know there are any people left. And they know that the ants are swarming, so they kind of release this Agent Orange type yellow gaseous powder situation into the surrounding area. And you see the father and mother who have escaped the ant attack on the house kind of like trying to make their way towards the lab, but being sprayed with this chemical that's killing them. And it's these big splashes of yellow. And when you see the bodies later on, they're kind of, the yellow has kind of turned their clothing this kind of like mottled green color, and they're dead skin is kind of this pale bluish color, and it's just, look, I'm gonna have to be the first to say it. Saul Bass has a good eye for color. And they're just kind of in this field of yellow powder, and it looks really cool, and it's also really jarring and visceral to experience.
It is, and in the same overall sequence, there's a shot of like teacups or something that have been sort of covered with this yellow powder, like in this kind of crystallized, almost like you're watching artifacts recovered from the Titanic or something. Not that that's a reference point that would have worked in 1974, but that like sort of covered in corrosion and decay, but it's not like corrosion and decay the way we think of them. And that's a striking image to me. It's one of the images I very clearly remembered from when I watched it the first time, and when it came through this time again, it really hit me. And again, it's very atmospheric. It's very gives you emotions that sort of short circuit the storytelling, and they're facilitated by the storytelling, right? Like, we need to get this moment where we see the houses being abandoned for that shot of the teacups to happen. Mm-hmm. But there is a very clear sense in which the shot itself is what the movie cares about, and not so much what is being signified by that shot. Yeah? Is that a fair way to describe some of how this film is playing with its visuals?
Most of the time, yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's just those moments of, like, a broken clock is right twice a day, where both of the things, like, kind of come into harmony.
Right, and I will say also, like, there are moments to me of very real, just kind of like, this is a cool visual. I feel very moved, or, not moved, but like, again, he's a graphic designer, and there's like graphic design moments in here, like where the shot is just interesting to look at. There's so as Michael Murphy's character is trying to figure out how to communicate with the ants, he's basically cracked that their language is mathematical. And it is sort of like, it feels like basic programming in a way, where it's like their grammar and vocabulary and syntax is all about like move in a certain direction and like find what is there. So there's actually two scenes where he uses this knowledge to program into a computer, like, drawing a shape, essentially, which was a much weirder and cooler thing to do in 1974 than it is to us now, obviously. But so there's this scene basically where Michael Murphy is having the computer print a rectangle, and so he's like narrating, go this many, da-da-da-da-da, then turn right this many degrees, and da-da-da-da-da-da. And while he's saying this, the camera is, like, focused on the print head, essentially. And so it's, like, panning very quickly with the printer as it's, like, laying this black line down on white paper, and the white paper is rolled up. And so as we're watching it, like, it almost becomes this kind of abstract, hard to follow, like, black being printed down on white, but because of the paper is rolled and it's scrolling and it's rolling up and rolling down, it feels like it's drawing these weird like arcs, even though they're straight lines, because the movement of the paper is sort of outpacing the camera's ability to keep up with it. And I think it's really cool to look at. It is a complete indulgence that has not anything to do with the story. So is that good or bad? I don't know. It's one of the things that sticks with me about the movie, but it's not doing anything.
Well, I think if it's a shot that has a narrative function and an aesthetic function, maybe they're not working in tandem, but the fact that they're both working is something.
I mean, that's the thing. I don't know that the shot does have a narrative function. Like, the moment has a narrative function. The moment is that he's figuring out how to communicate with ants. But we don't need to see that. It doesn't matter for the plot. And not everything needs to matter for the plot. I'm certainly the last person on earth who's going to say that it should. It's more that when the plot asserts itself, the plot does assert itself. And, like, I guess that it had less plot. because it has just enough plot for the plot to be bothersome.
Yeah. No, it's very bothersome. Yeah, it's like there's so many things about the plot that could have worked if it was tweaked in, well, probably many ways. But like on paper, this movie is basically like, what if the thing was set in the desert, but also it was Stalker? And that sounds really interesting, and that's not how it's delivered.
The thing that I kept thinking about, so 1974, 6 years prior to this, Stanley Kubrick gives the world 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Oh yeah, this movie does not exist without 2001.
This movie does not exist without 2001, not least because Saul Bass and Stanley Kubrick worked together, although I don't think they worked together on that. But I believe Saul Bass did the opening titles to Doctor Strangelove, but I might be misremembering that. But 2001 is basically saying, let's look at all of those really dumb, sometimes very bad, usually very dull, like space exploration films from the 50s, your Rocket Ship XM type movies. Let us turn that into beautiful visual poetry. Let us take this B-movie grist and form out of it interesting visual art. And I feel like this movie is basically trying to take like the beginning of the end or something and shoot it like it's 2001. And Saul Bass is not Stanley Kubrick. Shocker. But I think the idea is sound. The execution isn't there just because this isn't a film that makes me not care about its plot. I don't want to say in a way that I don't care about the plot of 2001. In 2001, a lot of the plot, I think, can sort of take or leave itself. Like, I've never been terribly compelled by the, like, what happens at the end of 2001, because, like, I don't know. I don't need to. It's beyond human comprehension is what it happens. This is a movie that is still functioning as a super intelligent bugs and the scientists in the desert and the girl with a capital T and a capital G who's kind of there to complicate things. It's a 50s bug movie. It is a 50s bug movie. Yeah. There's very little about the script that would have not worked in a sort of more pretentious than usual 50s bug movie, because there's all the stuff about like math. There's all the stuff towards the end about the ants are trying to... Again, the ants are trying to reshape us after us trying to control the ants for how many generations. The ants are now saying, no, it's our turn now. We're going to fashion you into what we need to survive. So it would be certainly a very brainy and pretentious bug movie, but like all the ingredients are there, and the film is not doing nearly enough to make me not care about that. And it needs to, because it's very bad at that material. Like it's just... It is not interesting to hear Michael Murphy try to explain to Nigel Davenport how the ant math language works.
No, and that's all there is to the plot, really.
Right. Like, not even that as a synecdoche for the plot, like that as the plot, like Michael Murphy yelling at Nigel Davenport is like 80% of the narrative content of this film.
Yeah, and then it's such a diffuse movie. It just kind of wanders. And yeah, no, it's interesting because usually when a movie has a plot like this that I can't connect with and strong visuals, that's something that I think that you would react to more. But I mean, obviously you're laying out your case of why. But I do think it's interesting just how it is this weird collection of successes and failures that I don't think I can call bad, but it's not good. It's just kind of there. It's interesting. Mm-hmm.
insofar as it is a collection of successes and failures, and I think that's fair. The failures are all to do with the storytelling, and the successes are all to do with the visuals and the sound.
Uh-huh.
And I'm on board with that. I'm fine with that. It is a film where the successes make me feel like Saul Bass, if he'd gotten 4 or 5 movies to direct, by the end of that, he would have really been doing some pretty great stuff. I think this was his, like, let's try some stuff out, let's start working through it. So I'm a 3.5 stars on this movie. Comfortably, never really thought either time I watched it about having any other rating. At least a little bit of that 3.5 is probably almost more the promise of the Saul Bass directorial career we didn't get. Right?
Oh.
And the visuals are terrific, is the thing. Like the visuals are really great, the vibes are really great, and I do want to start talking about that because I feel like I've only said negative things about this film so far. But I do think the script really defeats Saul Bass. I don't think he doesn't diminish it the way he needs to. Something that actually leaps to mind. This movie was a stated influence on Panos Cosmatos when he made Beyond the Black Rainbow, which is a movie that I like substantially more than this. There is an example of a film where the vibes and the visuals and the colors and the shapes really do beat down the script. Like at a certain point, that movie's vibes are strong enough that I simply don't actually care what is quote unquote happening, and that's just a threshold that's never crosses that threshold to me.
Yeah, absolutely. But I do think you're right. We should start talking more distinctly positively about the movie. But I think the right way to do that is I have one nice thing to say about the plot, and then we can move on to everything else.
Go for it.
Or the script, I suppose. I really, really like there's a line after the house has been attacked by ants and the family has just barely escaped. They jump into the back of a pickup truck and they drive through the moat of lit gasoline that they have erected around the house. And the wife turns to her husband and says, "I forgot to turn out the light." And I thought that was a really good moment of just kind of this domesticity in the face of unknowable horror that was really interesting.
Sure.
But that's the only moment of anyone saying anything on screen that I liked at all.
I mean, I think the idea, if this was like a pulpy short story, I think some of the ideas about ant math language and about like the reveals at the end of how the ants are trying to like take their rightful place as the dominant species, some of that has good bones. I think this movie does not get at them well, so I'm going to say that there's, I think, a little bit more in the writing that works than just the one thing. But
right.
But no, I do think that is a fair point that does work in terms of the script. I would like to bring us into talking about the film's visuals by returning to the poster that you said you found very striking. Because what is interesting to me about the poster, it is striking in and of itself, but it's also, I look at that poster and three things sort of simultaneously happen in my brain.
Okay.
4, I guess, because there's this like kind of war-torn ant-apocalypse visible behind the hand. That's the poster's very much about the hand in the middle of the image. But so it's a hand sort of in this like gripped, like not like gripping, but it's like a sort of clawed gesture, like the fingers are all bent in, the thumb is bent in. Palm facing us, hole in the middle of the palm, ant crawling out of the hole. And I already used the word stigmata, but that's basically what it is. It's very bluntly religious imagery, a hole in the middle of a palm. But also, it feels very specifically like a combination of the poster for Fritz Lang's M and the ants crawling out of a hand imagery from, is it Nushan Andalou or Lodge Door? One of the Buñuel Dali collaborations, and I'm suddenly drawing a blank on which one it is. I think it's in Shenandoah.
I I can't remember.
It's one of the two. I'm mortified that I can't remember which one of the two it is, but one of those two very beloved classics of surrealist cinema has a shot of ants crawling out of the palm of someone's hand, and it's a big deal. And so this poster, I think, is unambiguously, consciously drawing from both of those things.
It's Un Chien Andalou.
It is Un Chien Andalou. Okay, that's what I thought, but I wasn't confident. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, do I know for a fact that Saul Bass directed the poster? I actually have no idea, but designed the poster. He certainly was capable of it. And he certainly gave the film the images that lead to that poster.
And it's evoking something that he would have done.
It's evoking something that he would have done. And I think that the movie is aware of its forebearers. Like, this poster, again, it's not incidentally evoking Un Chien Andalou and M. It's clearly doing it on purpose. And I think that is something that I do really like about this movie. It is not just generating images and being like, isn't this image cool? It is, to use fancy grad student term, it's in conversation. Ew. It is trying to talk to other images that exist outside of the film and evoke those things. I mentioned the shot of the cups covered in that yellow powder. To me, that is he's thinking about sort of those that footage of like the test towns in the Nevada desert that they bomb with nuclear, bombs. That's what that feels like to me. Is like that sort of weirdly covered in a version of decay that isn't any version of decay we know from our own lived experience. That's going on there to me. At least I think that it feels like it's very sort of consciously evoking that sort of not newsreel footage, but like documentary footage. And I think a lot of this movie's imagery is doing that, or it is sort of evoking feeling through its relationship to other things it's evoking.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And it's also just really good footage of ants.
It is really good footage of ants. It's
really, 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 really good footage of ants.
It's like alarmingly crisp close-ups of just ants wriggling around in ant hills, but also good shot choice of how are we looking at the ants and what are they doing, and how are they looking. That just doesn't seem possible.
And it's that, and it all ties in very nicely. The thing that did strike me that I didn't remember from the first time I watched it, when I rewatched it this time, was how just wonderfully textured the cinematography is. Really, really just kind of rich, grainy imagery. And that sort of very 70s way where you're never going to get movies that are beautiful because of the stocks that they had access to, so the good cinematographers figured out a way to weaponize the ugliness, essentially. And I think this movie does this. I think that some of those shots, until it becomes clear that it's only ever going to do one thing with its shots of the inside of the science lab. But until that becomes clear, there's just this kind of very gritty, tangible physicality to those places, and this sort of fully saturated colors, but like fully saturated colors trapped in this kind of like overall grayed out 70s film stock vibe. And that matches really well, I think, with the footage of the ants. And I to a certain extent, I think that the live action footage was shot with an eye to making sure that it matched the footage of the ants. So it all kind of feels like it's this one thing where it's all very granular. In a way that I think is really interesting. And I will say, not for any reason, the cinematographer for this film is named Dick Bush. and god damn you if you don't find that amusing in the most primitive 7-year-old child way.
No, that's great. And that actually, complete tangent, since we started here. Actually drawing us back to Teen Wolf, I do love actual historical gay people whose names sound like old-timey slurs for gay people, like Dick Sargent. But also Tab Hunter is another good one. Like, oh, have you seen the Henderson kid? He's a real tab hunter.
Oh my god. I never thought of that. That's really great.
Thank you.
That's really good.
But anyway, yeah, anytime, like, there are a lot of great dicks in Hollywood. There's Dick Wolf, of course, which elicits some great imagery, and also Dick Warlock is a particularly prime Hollywood dick.
I'm not sure if I'm familiar with Dick Warlock, but I'm going to have to figure out what he's been up to, because that is a great name.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he either played Michael Myers at one point or was a stunt man in Halloween 3.
Okay.
I could be totally wrong, but he was a stunt guy.
Okay,
in
gotcha.
a bunch of stuff.
Cool.
Anyway,
but yes, to our present Dick, I will say that Dick Bush has like just an objectively very solid CV. There's a couple like B movies in there that are pretty crummy, but his first film was the Peter Watkins documentary is already straining the word, but the film Culloden from 1964. So Dick Bush is legit. So I don't want to just land on like his name is Dick Bush, haha.
Except you kind of do.
Which is funny, which is the reason I started down this road. But his filmography, which immediately after this would go to Tommy by Ken Russell, but also has Culloden. There's another film here that was like felt really like Twins of Evil and Savage Messiah, which are, you know, Twins of Evil is clearly a grungy B movie. Savage Messiah is not. Savage Messiah is a film about a sculptor. But these are films that all have that kind of scruffy, ugly on purpose, very richly physical look to them, especially Culloden. And I feel like he's bringing something here that really matters to this film. And it makes sense, because if this is a film that is primarily about like just the kind of evocative atmosphere of its imagery, you would need to have an image maker who's very good at getting to that. And I think he is. Even in the sort of really dull, talky scenes.
Yeah.
Again, before it becomes clear that they're all going to be shot the same way.
Yeah, no, well, that's the thing, is that this movie just, even at 84 minutes, is just too long. It doesn't have enough to stretch out to that time. Yeah, no, there's some good stuff. I especially like there are certain shots of this ant that has kind of like a jade green butt. And then there's parts of it where it's crawling around these kind of purple amethyst kind of crystals, and that's some like kind of gorgeous, lovely stuff. There are some close-up shots also of ants being crushed, where I was like, oh, ASPCA was not on board for this movie.
Yeah, there's a really remarkable scene. It's one of the only human scenes that I think works as well as the ant scenes, where like every day Nigel Davenport unravels a bit harder.
Yeah.
And so towards the end, there's one where he's just like going apeshit trying to smash this one ant, and we get the like super close up of like the terrain where the ant is navigating that he's about to smash. And by terrain, I mean like the counter.
Yeah.
But it's shot in this really strange, close way where it just feels completely alien, and you can't really recognize what's going on, and then there's like hand in it all of a sudden. And I find that to be just a really shocking, disorientingly violent moment in a good way. And then he turns his hand, and we see like it's just lacerated because he slammed his hand down on broken glass. And it's really only in that moment that I realized that it was broken glass.
Is that okay? Because he had that like ant bite that he got earlier, and I thought it was just that, but getting worse, because it was like progressively kind of getting more and more infected.
Oh, maybe that is. I took it to be that he smashed his hand on something that cut it, because it didn't look infected to me; it looked bleeding to me. But
okay, I mean, it could have been both. Also,
it could have been both.
But I just assumed, I was just like, oh, things are getting bad for that guy.
Yep.
Yeah. Is there anything else? Are we missing anything?
I will say this is a fine point, but it's one that I care about a lot. This is a movie that does something weird with its credits. And it was still a big deal to do something weird with your credits in the mid-70s. So the phases of the title refer to sort of the ants evolving whatever is evolving with the ants. Yeah. And the film opens with absolutely no other text than a sort of computer font in the upper left corner that says Phase 1. And then we later get Phase 2 and Phase 3. And then after everything has gone to hell, and whatever is going to happen happens, it cuts to this shot of a sunrise. Zoomed in so the sun is really, really... Or maybe it's sunset. Doesn't matter. Sun against an orange sky. Zoomed in so the sun's really, really big in the frame. There's like a hill behind it. And then we see Phase 4... Or we actually start to get the credits, so I think we get Paramount Pictures Presents Phase 4, but now it's not in the same font. Now it's just in a kind of very simple Arial-esque sans serif font, and then we get the film's credits. So now only at the very end, and I just, again, from the perspective of this is a guy whose thing was graphic design for credit sequences, the way that the credits are brought into this movie is surprising because it's at the end, and also the way that the font changes in that moment just feels kind of very... We are purposefully leaving the world of science fiction in this final moment because it's not science fiction anymore. It's become this kind of weird spiritual journey. And I like it because this is before Star Wars sort of normalizes the put all of the end credits at a scroll at the end of the movie. I know it was a huge deal when The Godfather did something similar in 1972. I believe, speaking of George Lucas, that THX 1138 had done something similar in 1971. And so it's still a brash, cool, brave thing to do, to be like, nope, we're not going to have any opening credits whatsoever, not even the film's title. And then when they do come, they're this kind of just interesting visual.
Yeah, no, that I'm glad you brought that up because that's not something that I've really considered is the history of that. Like, I obviously know older movies have front end credit, like credits on the front end, and newer movies tend to have credits on the back end. And more recently, we're getting rid of opening credits almost in their entirety. But I never thought about the specific time that was more of a malleable dotted line. So I'm glad you brought that context.
Yeah, and I mean, I can certainly say that it was like a war. Haha. Like getting Star Wars to have that, for Star Wars to have the credits it has was like a fairly major point of contention between George Lucas and the studio.
Oh, that's really interesting. I did not know that. Oh, what do you know?
Yep.
No, yeah, that's really interesting, and that does add to that because it does have that sense of you immediately plunging into the movie. Which is a thing that is frequently used to advantage in movies like this, but like I said, it's just been used too often recently, just for any type of movie that I didn't think about it. So I'm
right.
Glad.
Well,
because
it's now kind of, especially for like big popcorn movies, don't even show the title of the film literally to start the movie and then give us everything at the end.
Yeah,
that's kind of like a default. Especially, I think like basically every single Marvel movie does that at this point.
Yeah,
and I find it boring. But when a movie's doing it because it's a choice and not just because, oh well, this is how we do it, I feel like there's a charge to it. And in this case, I just like that we don't see that this is called Phase 4 until after we understand what Phase 4 is in reference to.
Yeah, no, I think that's important because like you walked in knowing that you're going to see a movie called Phase 4. So once it starts with Phase 1, you immediately get the sense of like, oh, we're building to the thing that this movie is.
Right. And then it punctuates, and I do think that last shot of the sunset is among the most beautiful things in this very visually driven film.
Mm-hmm. So it's a valuable place to start and end. The middle is up and down, but that's nice to know.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that is probably the only other thing I had to say.
Well, I'm glad you brought it up. I will bring up one last incredibly unrelated thing, which is that Michael Murphy went on to be in a very kooky Australian quasi-slasher called Strange Behavior in 1981, which I recommend quite a bit. It got well, if you ever saw the James Marsden movie Disturbing Behavior in the late 90s, this is the movie that is an uncredited remake of, and it is considerably more textured and interesting and kind of gross and weird.
Okay. Yeah, I will say I have not seen that film. I have probably at some point heard of that film. Michael Murphy is... I just like him.
Yeah. He's hot, you know? Anyway.
I don't know that I agree with that even slightly, but I find him to be a very... I'm pleased when he shows up in my movies, especially when those movies are directed by Robert Altman.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's nice to have a reliable presence. But yes, so that's phase 4. Next time we're going to be doing another June bug movie, but it's going to be pretty different, probably. We are covering the 1997 film Mimic, which is also going to be a first-time watch for me and a non-first-time watch for Tim. I'm very excited for that.
I don't know that we've ever done that with both films in a given month before.
I think you're right, because it's usually either both of us haven't seen it or a mix.
Or it's you showing me one of the 700 slasher films you've seen that I haven't.
Look, I've tried to avoid too many slashers on this podcast, but we might be due. I do regret missing Superstition during Witchcraft Month. But yeah, I am really undereducated in early English language Guillermo del Toro, so I'm very curious about what's going on in Mimic.
And this is the first English language Guillermo del Toro, if I'm not mistaken. I believe it was only his second film.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, because he did Mimic, he did the Hellboys, he did Blade 2. Yeah, I think Mimic was probably first. Well, I will have that information at my fingertips in 2 weeks when we talk about Mimic. Anyway, so yeah, stay tuned for that. In the meantime, you can find more of Tim's reviews and mine, as well as other podcasts at alternateending.com. Thank you so much for listening, and don't let the bed bugs bite. Ooh.
She hate me.